You walk down a crowded street today. You look around and see people. Lots of people. But everyone you see is exactly the same biological species as you. You take this completely for granted. Why wouldn't you? But the real answer to your evolutionary past is much stranger. You are actually the last lonely survivor of a massive, diverse family tree. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You check the news and discover a completely different type of human lives in the next country. Not just someone with a different culture or language, a totally different biological species. Would you fight them? Would you ignore them? Or would you try to connect with them? This is not a weird science fiction scenario. This was your everyday reality for the vast majority of your existence on this planet. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth was incredibly crowded with different kinds of humans. You were never alone. So where did everyone else go? Step back in time about 50,000 years. You are walking through the freezing, brutal landscapes of Ice Age Europe. You are desperately looking for food. The wind is howling through the barren pine trees. Suddenly, you see another figure standing in the distance. They look a lot like you, but something is off. They are much shorter, incredibly stocky, and absolutely packed with muscle. Their brow ridges are heavily pronounced, casting dark, intimidating shadows over their eyes. You have just encountered a Neanderthal. For a very long time, your modern culture unfairly dismissed them as mindless, grunting brutes. You pictured them sitting stupidly in caves. You thought they were biologically inferior to you. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different, shocking story. Their brains were actually larger than yours. They did not just throw rocks. They manufactured complex tools using a sophisticated method called Mousterian technology. They survived and thrived in some of the harshest, most unforgiving environments this planet has ever produced. They were the ultimate apex predators of their time. They hunted massive woolly mammoths up close with heavy thrusting spears. They took down incredibly dangerous cave bears in close-quarters combat. When archaeologists look at Neanderthal skeletons, they see a shocking pattern of severe bone fractures. The only modern humans with similar injury patterns are professional rodeo riders. They lived hard, brutal, but highly intelligent lives. They also cared deeply for their injured. Skeletons of older Neanderthals show they survived for years with missing arms or severe arthritis. They could only have survived if their community fed them and protected them. They buried their dead with extreme care, sometimes even placing flowers in the graves. How did you interact with them when your modern ancestors finally left Africa and entered their freezing territory? Did you fight brutal, bloody wars over the best hunting grounds? Did you avoid each other entirely in the vast wilderness? The truth was completely hidden for millennia until a massive breakthrough in modern technology. The answer was finally revealed through groundbreaking genetic research. Evolutionary geneticist Svante Pääbo spent years working on what many scientists thought was an impossible task. He was trying to extract ancient DNA from tiny, degraded, contaminated fragments of Neanderthal bone. It was a painstakingly slow, frustrating process. He had to filter out the DNA of modern bacteria and the scientists who handled the bones. But his relentless work completely shattered your understanding of human history. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that your ancestors did not just fight them. You did not just ignore them in the dark forests of Europe. You intimately mated with them. If your ancestors are from anywhere outside of sub-Saharan Africa, your DNA is roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal. You literally carry their ancient ghosts inside your very cells. Their genetic legacy is not just a biological curiosity. It actively affects your body right now, today. It influences how your immune system fights off new viruses. It affects how quickly your blood clots when you get a paper cut. It influences your skin's ability to produce keratin, which helped your ancestors survive the cold. It even plays a significant role in how susceptible you are to modern depression, specific allergies. You always thought they went completely extinct. But a crucial piece of them survived directly inside of you. But Neanderthals were not the only ones sharing the planet with you. Travel thousands of miles east to the freezing, high-altitude Altai Mountains of Siberia. Here, in a dark and incredibly isolated cave, another phantom human was waiting to be discovered. They are known today as the Denisovans. You know almost nothing about what they physically looked like. You have only ever found a few unusually large teeth, a piece of a jaw, and a single, tiny pinky finger bone. But that tiny finger bone contained a genetic goldmine. Their sequenced DNA tells an astonishing story of an entire population spanning across Asia. They were distant, elusive cousins of the Neanderthals, heavily adapted to living in extreme cold and thin mountain air. And just like with the Neanderthals, your ancestors did not just pass them by, you aggressively interbred with them too. This ancient connection gave you a massive, distinct survival advantage. Today, people living in the extreme high altitudes of Tibet carry a very specific, powerful Denisovan gene. It is scientifically called the EPAS1 gene. This unique gene radically alters how the body regulates hemoglobin production in the blood. It prevents the blood from becoming dangerously thick at high elevations. It allows modern Tibetans to breathe easily at crushing altitudes that would make you incredibly sick or even kill you. Your ancestors essentially downloaded biological software from another species just to survive the mountains. How unbelievably incredible is that? People in the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and indigenous Australians carry even higher amounts of Denisovan DNA. You are a messy, complex biological mosaic of different human species. But the story gets even stranger and much smaller. Travel far south to the tropical, volcanic island of Flores in Indonesia. It is a stunningly beautiful, incredibly isolated paradise. But evolutionary isolation does very weird things to biology. It is called the island rule. Here, because resources were so incredibly limited, large animals evolved to become much smaller to survive, and small animals evolved to become terrifyingly larger. You shared this nightmare island with giant, aggressive storks and dwarf elephants called stegodons. You also shared it with giant Komodo dragons that hunted through the dense jungle. And right in the middle of this chaos, you shared it with another human species. They are formally known by science as Homo floresiensis, but the world quickly came to know them simply as the Hobbits. They stood barely over 3 feet tall as fully grown adults. Their brains were incredibly tiny, roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's brain. You might naturally think they were utterly primitive and incapable of complex thought, but they were actively making sophisticated stone tools and hunting giant rats. Paleoanthropologist Matthew Tocheri analyzed their tiny wrist bones in excruciating detail. He discovered that their wrists were fundamentally, structurally different from yours. They completely lacked the specialized shock-absorbing features that allow you to throw heavy objects with high speed and precision. They were not just a shrunken, smaller version of you. They were on an entirely different, ancient evolutionary path. They survived on that hostile island for hundreds of thousands of years. They lived through massive volcanic eruptions, terrifying predators, and rapidly changing sea levels. They were incredibly resilient survivors. And they were still there when your fully modern ancestors first arrived on the shores in wooden boats. Imagine that unbelievable moment of first contact. What did your ancestors think when they saw miniature versions of humans hunting in the dense forest? Did they see them as dangerous, unpredictable animals? Did they view them as magical, mythological forest spirits? Did they somehow recognize them as distant, long-lost cousins? You will never know for absolute certainty what happened during those tense encounters. But they mysteriously and completely vanished shortly after your taller, hungrier species arrived. Let's travel to another island, this time further north in the Philippines. Welcome to the dark, humid Calao Cave on the island of Luzon. Here, ambitious scientists unearthed another massive shock to your already complicated family tree. They found a completely new species now called Homo luzonensis. They were another very small-bodied human living entirely on an isolated island. But their physical anatomy was incredibly strange and contradictory. They had the small, relatively simple teeth of modern humans like you. But they had the ancient, heavily curved toe and finger bones of humans that lived millions of years earlier in Africa. They were a bizarre, walking patchwork of ancient and modern biology. They were completely unique to that one specific island. And they were living there, climbing trees and foraging, at the exact same time your ancestors were starting to aggressively spread across the globe. The world was absolutely teeming with different human evolutionary experiments. Move over to the massive landmass of East Asia, and the picture gets even more complex and intimidating. In Harbin, China, A massive, incredibly well-preserved skull was hidden at the bottom of an abandoned well for nearly 90 years. It was hidden by a laborer to protect it from the invading Japanese army. When modern scientists finally got to analyze it, they realized it belonged to yet another totally unknown human species. They officially named it Homo longi. You probably know it by its much cooler nickname, Dragon Man. Dragon Man had a truly massive brain, comparable in size to yours. But he had large, square eye sockets, a huge, thick brow ridge, and a wildly wide face. Some leading researchers believe Dragon Man might actually be an even closer relative to you than the Neanderthals. Imagine a human species just as smart as you, but physically massive and incredibly robust. They dominated the freezing, brutal landscapes of northern Asia for generations. They built complex shelters, hunted large game, and lived deeply rich, complex lives. You shared the planet with these brilliant giants. And what about the oldest mysteries still lingering in Africa? Recent genetic studies of modern West African populations show something incredibly weird. Their DNA contains stretches of genetic material that do not match Neanderthals, Denisovans, or modern humans. It is called a ghost lineage. It means that relatively recently, your ancestors in Africa interbred with a completely unknown, deeply ancient human species. We have 0 fossils of them. We have 0 artifacts. We only know they existed because their phantom DNA is still actively circulating in the human gene pool today. There are literally ghosts in your blood. Now let's go deep, deep underground in South Africa to find the strangest human of all. You are squeezing painfully through a pitch-black, incredibly narrow limestone tunnel called the Superman's Crawl. You are completely surrounded by crushing, solid rock. This is the terrifyingly remote Rising Star Cave System. Here, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger made a discovery that aggressively broke all the established rules of human evolution. Deep inside a hidden, nearly inaccessible chamber, his team found the remains of Homo naledi. They were a truly bizarre, impossible mix of ancient and modern features. They had tiny, primitive brains, roughly a third the size of yours. They had flared, ape-like ribs and heavily curved fingers, clearly built for climbing tall trees. But they had feet that looked almost exactly like yours, built for long-distance walking. The most shocking part was not their strange bodies, but exactly where they were found. Dozens of bodies were intentionally placed deep inside a completely dark, totally inaccessible chamber. It was not a living space. It was not a trap where they fell in by accident. To get there, they would have absolutely needed artificial light. They would have needed to master and control fire. And they would have needed a deeply complex, emotional understanding of mortality. You always arrogantly believed that burying the dead was a uniquely modern human behavior. You thought it absolutely required a massive, highly sophisticated brain like yours. But Homo naledi was allegedly doing it with a brain the size of an orange. They were dragging their loved ones through the suffocating dark to lay them to rest. They felt deep grief, just like you do when you lose someone. The timeline of human history is clearly not a single, neat, straight line leading directly to you. You are not the inevitable climax of a perfect story. Evolution is not a ladder. It is a wildly tangled, messy, overgrown bush. There were distinct periods in history when 4, 5, or even 6 completely different human species walked the earth at the exact same moment. You were never the absolute pinnacle of evolution. You were just one bizarre experiment among many. So the ultimate, terrifying question remains. Why are you the only one left standing today? Why did the brilliant, muscular Neanderthals completely disappear? Why did the mountain-dwelling Denisovans vanish into the snow? Why did the resilient Hobbits die out on their island paradise? Some scientists firmly believe it was a rapidly changing, violent climate that wiped them out. The last ice age ended, the massive forests shrank, and their specific megafauna food sources completely disappeared. They simply could not adapt fast enough. Others believe a much darker, much bloodier truth. They believe that you completely wiped them out. Your ancestors were incredibly efficient, relentless hunters. You were highly cooperative, but also deeply, aggressively competitive. When you entered their long-held territories, you relentlessly outcompeted them for every single available resource. You ate their food, you took their caves, and you might have even actively hunted them down. But there is a third, infinitely more complex, and strangely beautiful possibility. You did not just ruthlessly kill them all, you systematically absorbed them. Your specific species has one massive, unparalleled superpower. It is not your intelligence, and it is not your tools. It is your extreme hypersociality. You are biologically driven to deeply connect, loudly communicate, and form massive, sprawling networks. Evolutionary psychologists call this the Dunbar number effect. Most early humans could only maintain relationships with a few dozen individuals, but you could maintain networks of hundreds. You relentlessly trade information, tools, and resources across vast, impossible distances. The Neanderthals mostly lived in very small, highly isolated family groups. When a devastating, brutal winter hit Europe, a Neanderthal family had to survive entirely on its own. If they failed to find food, they quietly died in the dark. But your ancestors had extensive networks of friends in the next valley. You had ancient trade routes. You had sprawling social safety nets. Over tens of thousands of grueling years, your massive, deeply interconnected populations simply swallowed up the smaller, isolated groups of other humans. They did not go extinct in the sudden, dramatic way you picture dinosaurs going extinct. They simply faded into your ever-expanding genetic background. They quite literally became part of you. This revelation completely changes how you must view yourself in the mirror. You are not a pure, isolated, biologically perfect species. You are an incredibly messy hybrid. You are a walking patchwork quilt of ancient, battered survivors. You carry the raw physical strength of the Neanderthals directly in your immune system. You carry the breathtaking resilience of the Denisovans deep in your blood. You carry the genetic legacy of a dozen vanished worlds inside your twisting DNA. You are, in a very real sense, a walking graveyard of human species. But you are also a living, breathing monument to their incredible survival. They live on quietly every single time you take a breath. So the next time you feel completely alone and disconnected in the modern world, remember this profound truth. You are carrying millions of years of vanished history inside your very bones. You are never truly alone. You walk down a crowded street today. You look around and see people, lots of people. And now you know exactly who they really are.